We're pleased to have with us right now on the line the congressman from Virginia Beach, as we just mentioned earlier, and other parts of Virginia representing the 4th District, Congressman Randy Forbes, and he's got a compelling piece of legislation called the CAP Act that we're going to be talking about. But first and foremost, Congressman, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, John, it's always great to be with you. Appreciate the good work that you continue to do.
Well, thanks, sir. We are very excited about the bill that you're sponsoring called the CAP Act, which basically says the more that Congress spends, the less congressmen get paid. How does this work?
Well, John, you and I both know that we have to fundamentally change the way Washington thinks and the way it works. And we can do one of two things. We can either continue just to scream at each other, between pundit to pundit and member to member and candidate to candidate and get nothing done, or we can step back and say, how do we fundamentally change this process and make it work for the American people? If we look at the number one issue right now facing this country, without question, people on the left and right would agree, it's the spending problem that we have in the nation and how to get it under control. And we really have about three basic options. The first option we have is that the president could do that. He could come in from the executive side with his budgets and he could help get spending under control. His budgets have indicated he's not willing to do that, and the rhetoric he's using now suggests that he's not going to be willing to do that for the rest of his term. So we can't look to the executive branch to do that. The second thing is everybody has suggested the federal government do what the states have done, which is to have a balanced budget amendment. Great concept. I support that concept. The problem we have is it takes two-thirds vote to do it, and also it has to be ratified by the states, and we're running out of time, and unlikely we'd have time to get that passed in time to save us from where we're going. So the third thing is, how do you get legislators to have some skin in the game? And so we wrote a piece of legislation that's pretty simple. It just is this. We hire you to deal with the number one problem facing the country, which is spending. If you do it, we're going to pay you what you're supposed to get. If you don't do it, we're going to reduce your pay by the amount you fail. So if spending goes up by 10%, next year, we reduce members of Congress' pay by 10%. If it goes up by 5%, we reduce it by 5%. I think what that does is to help them have a little bit of self-interest in what they're doing. I think it would encourage them to get the spending under control.
So what you're attempting to do is bring real-life private sector reality to the Congress, because when you're in the private sector, as any executive is, your compensation is based on, in some part, how you perform in your job. And as you're pointing out, the number one responsibility of U.S. House members is to get a budget done. And right now we've got a $16.4 trillion debt that we can't see our way out of. So basically what you're saying is if I increase government spending by 5%, then my paycheck goes down 5%, right?
That's right. It's a great merit incentive, and you hit the nail on the head when you get a member of Congress. Now, look, everybody has things they'd like to see happen in Congress, and you're not going to get all those things done. But what we can agree on is the number one concern right now, the number one threat to the United States, everybody just about would agree on, is this out-of-control spending. So we're simply saying if you succeed, fine, here's your pay. But if you don't succeed, we're going to give you a disincentive in proportionate to how much you failed. And just one thing, John, a lot of people say Congress' goal is to get a budget. Well, historically that's been true, and as you know, the Senate's failed in that for almost 4 years.
Right.
But it's a bigger problem than that. It's not just getting a budget, because a bad budget is just as bad as no budget right now. What we have, we're beyond the situation of saying we just need a budget. We need a budget that will actually curtail our spending, where we're not continuing to spend more money than we take in every year, because otherwise there's no way we're going to turn this economy around and get the quality of life that the American people deserve.
There's no question now. What are the chances that your CAP Act gets out of committee and actually comes up on the floor?
John, up here, we don't even know what the chances are that we'll get a budget out, But I would say this. I think it makes a very good reason Anytime you're playing with the self-interest of members of Congress, I'm not going to say it's an easy lift, but I think it's the right thing to do. And if the American people get behind a concept like this, I think we can put pressure on to get it on the House floor for a vote. I think if it gets on the House floor for a vote, it's a good chance we get it passed. And if we get it passed, then we start dealing with a whole new animal, which is the Senate.
Well, you know what's interesting about it? It would be so interesting to see this get to the floor and see the arguments in opposition to that.
Well, you're exactly right. And what this really does, John, is it will ferret out the people who are sincere about cutting spending and the people who just use it as political rhetoric. And
Right.
we're far beyond the point where this country can afford more political rhetoric. We're at the point now where you're hearing one economist after the other that's telling us if we don't do this and fast, then we're burying ourselves deeper and deeper in a hole that we'll have a difficult time getting out of.
What Representative Forbes is saying is that if the spending in the United States goes up by 10%, then House members would get a pay cut by 10%. So there's a corresponding pay to performance, if you will. Now, speaking of the debt, Congressman, and the deficit that we have, if everybody is expecting in this town the same drama to play out with the debt ceiling, some Johnny Appleseed, Boehner, Ryan, somebody comes in at the final hour with a deal, and basically we increase the debt without any spending cuts behind it. Do you think there is a majority of Republicans in conference that are willing to see the government shut down or not increase the debt limit until we get real spending reductions?
John, I can't answer that. I haven't whipped them. I think it would be certainly a majority of Republicans who would be willing to do whatever it took to get the spending under control, but whether that's a majority of the members of the House, I can't answer that question. I can tell you two things, though. The first one is that the Speaker can prohibit bills from coming to the floor in and of himself. And so if he has the courage to do that, we can stop bills from coming to the floor. The second thing that I would say, though, is this. Nobody wants to see a government shut down. This is not something where we want to do like the president did the other day, come out and essentially beat yourself on the chest in front of a microphone and say, it's my way or the highway. We don't want to do that. What we want to do, though, is to say we need to rationally come to the table as Americans and answer this question. Do we want to run out of money at a point down the road where we can no longer pay our bills at all, no matter what we do, which is the direction we're heading? Or is it worth us taking a strong stand, even if it meant perhaps shutting the government down temporarily, so that we can save the government in the long term? That's the fundamental question we have to ask. It's like the old oil filter commercial, pay me now or pay me later. This decision is going to be made. It's whether we make it now where we can still do something about it, or whether we let the country go into bankruptcy where we'll not be able to do anything about it. I think this is the time to have that fight and to get it fixed now. I hope the Speaker will stand firm on that.
Representative Forbes, do you believe that at the end of the day it's going to come down to a matter of political courage?
I think it does. I think this whole town, when you get things done that are good, comes down to political courage overlaid on principle and character. And even though we don't see as much of it as we'd like to see in today's world, that is what still will carry this country. It always has, and I think that's what it's going to take to change where we're headed financially.
Can we shift to foreign policy for a second,
Sure.
Representative Forbes? The nomination of Chuck Hagel, former Nebraska Senator Hagel, for Secretary of Defense. How do you weigh in on that?
Well, I'm very concerned in one, the direction that Mr. Hagel has had in terms of comments that he's made about our allies, especially looking at Israel. But more importantly, I'm concerned about his vision of where he wants to take national defense. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt if he gets nominated, because, as you know, we don't have a part in that nomination. But I'm going to also watch very carefully. I know with Secretary Panetta, his vision was to have a strong defense. Had a lot of meetings with him, was confident at least where he wanted to take our national defense. I'm very, very concerned about Mr. Mr. Hagel, and where he may want to take us. And this is a very dangerous time for this country, and we can't continue this dismantling of the national defense that we've seen over the last few years. It's too dangerous of a world to have that happen.
So moving over to the Syrian situation, very difficult to see 87 students get killed in this bombing. We don't really know if the university bombing was from the government, from the opposition. There's conflicting evidence, but we've got some Republicans calling for us to get involved with the rebels. Do you think that's the right course, or should we stay out of it?
John, I think we need to be very, very cautious about getting involved in any kind of military action in other parts of the globe right now. We are stretched so thin with where we are, and it's time for us to kind of reassess our military strength, make sure we have long-term priorities of where we're going to use that military strength. And I would be very, very cautious before I got involved militarily in another situation right now.
Congressman Forbes, we're almost out of time. Final question. Today, President Obama is going to outline legislation on firearms that he's put together with the vice president. How do you think that's going to play in the House?
Well, he's the President of the United States, and we'll take his proposals, and we will have full and balanced and fair and balanced hearings for those proposals, where we will actually try to look at the details. I think one of the things you can't do, John, is the way they've done this, which is to basically sit in a room and bring some people and say, what can we do? What sounds good politically? And let's throw these things out there. What we will do is go through the analysis and the facts, and we'll try to work through and say what actually does work and what doesn't work. But the second thing is we won't forget that this government was set up by our founders to have checks and balances. One of those checks was Congress. One was the Constitution. And the president shouldn't be bypassing either one of those checks, because if he does, the end product is not going to be a good one. And so we're going to make sure that whatever we do is going to be effective, but it's also going to be balanced with constitutional protections, and also go through Congress to get it done.
Well said. Congressman Randy Forbes, representing the 4th District of Virginia. He's a Republican, and he has just introduced compelling legislation in Congress called the CAP Act. If you want to get more information, you can just go to randyforbes.com. Congressman, as always, we want to thank you for your time and for being with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Have a great day.